started. All right, so have either of you taken classes that reviewed study design, like different cohort studies, case control studies?
We both took
the one with Teresa Seaman?
Yep.
Okay. So some of this is review, but we're looking at it from a different perspective. We're going to be digging into this is the study design, and thus these are like challenges we might face, right? So I know what she does generally, but first of all, it's good to review anyway, because that is a crash course. Like when I teach epidemiology, a whole course is devoted to cohort studies, a whole lecture is devoted to case control studies, right? So we're going to zip through it, but with an eye towards that, knowing that you've seen this before. But again, feel free to chime in if you want something explained in more detail. My goal is to talk about this for about an hour and then to review. I like to give like group time to sort of review the questions on the papers and then review it together, but I think we'll just skip to the reviewing it together stage. Okay, so types of studies. So these are like the gross, categories, experimental versus observational. Experimental refers to mainly what types of studies that we are familiar with or we're exposed to, which is randomized clinical trials. What experimental refers to here is your manipulation of the study, so that you really create the groups, you create the treatment groups, and you observe the results. That is versus observational. Observational studies are those that observe what's happening in real life. Now you manipulate it in that you kind of decide your comparison groups, etc., but you're not manipulating the treatment, right? So you're observing what people were exposed to and the outcomes. Okay, so those are like the kind of grand categories. And what is generally our gold standard? Right, randomized clinical trials. I would argue that we lose out in RCTs. So for example, some of the vitamin studies done in RCTs use very high dosages. That's not something we would necessarily sort of ask people to take, or they're higher dosages than one would take in just the pill form. So sometimes it's overkill, I think, the randomized clinical trials, and the situations are so pristine that do they really reflect real life, right? So in some cases, observational might be ideal in terms of really measuring the associations, because we want to reflect real life, because real life is where we live, right? So we need to keep that in mind when we say gold standard. That's like a major caveat. So, hey, how are you? Welcome back. That's okay. Just got started. So we're looking at different types of study designs. We're going to start with randomized clinical trials. Okay. I'm going to read this out loud. This is from a Scottish surgeon, James Lind, a physician in 1747 in England. He was a seaman and a sailor at sea. He was the physician at sea with other sailors, and they had a big problem with scurvy. Okay, so this is from his journal. I took 12 patients in the scurvy on board the Salisbury at sea. The cases were as similar as I could have them. They lay together in one place and had one diet common to them all. 2 of these were ordered a quart of cider per day. 2 others took 25 guts of elixir vitriol. 2 others took 2 spoonfuls of vinegar. 2 were put under a course of seawater. 2 others had 2 oranges and 1 lemon given them each day. 2 others took the bigness of nutmeg. 1747. The most sudden and visible good effects were perceived from the use of oranges and lemons. One of those who had taken them being at the end of 6 days fit for duty. The other was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick. They got much better, right? What makes this, I would argue this is a randomized trial, what makes this a sort of maybe randomized in quotes, but what makes this, have any similarity to a randomized clinical trial as we see it?
You're signing treatment.
Signing treatment.
To a group of patients who have the same issue.
Look at that line saying, right, so they have the same issue, that they all have scurvy, and we're looking to see if they get better. But they lay together in one place and had one diet common to them all, right?
Same confounder or same covariates.
Right, so we are trying to maintain comparability. Okay, so we're trying to maintain comparability because we want to tease out what's different about these people. In order to tease out what's different, we want the things that we sort of don't care about, right, to be as similar as possible. I say the things we don't care about because, as we'll see, we cannot assess things that are the same, right? If everyone is the same, we can't actually see that, right? If we're only looking at associations among women, we cannot see the associations for men, right? So we can't look at gender or sex as a variable. So what else? What makes this important? Assigning different treatments is a simple thing, comparison, right? You cannot do studies properly without comparison. So here he had a certain element of comparison. The sample sizes are very, very low, but let's, for our purposes, if everyone was eating oranges and lemons, he wouldn't really know if it was the oranges or lemons, but in this case, it would probably be so obvious that, it would suggest it was the oranges and lemons, but he had some comparison with which to operate. Okay, so experimental studies evaluate interventions in order to modify some natural course of the disease. Okay, so we're doing this, we're evaluating interventions that we are kind of projecting onto a group, right, a treatment group. Randomization is the key to this gold standard. What makes this the gold standard is that we're randomizing. Okay, so we're trying to make people as comparable as possible. This is the flow of a randomized trial. So we start with a study population. We randomly assign to new treatment or current treatment, or new treatment, no treatment, depending on the standard of care. And then we follow up and see if they improve or not improve, right? Okay, so what are the quintessential characteristics of a randomized trial that are most important, especially in terms of collecting data or setting up your trial? So there are really three aspects that make the randomized trial what it is. One is randomization, as we said, to try to maintain comparability, and we're going to dig into each of these. One is blinding. We'll see what happens when we don't have a blinded design, right? And one is treatment groups. So we're going to go over each of these, but just to introduce you to these ideas, the treatment group, we're going to look at the comparability of outcome measures for treated and non-treated groups. So what if you are just very, very carefully monitoring the treated group and not carefully monitoring the non-treated group? You're going to introduce a bias in your study, right? So if you have different monitoring procedures for each group, you've already introduced a bias, and that could affect, what your results are. How about types of treatment assignment? So we're going to talk about the different types of treatment assignment. There's the crossover trial, there's the factorial trial. Those are two kind of subtypes of randomized clinical trials. And then assigned and received. So we all know people can get assigned a treatment. They may not actually take the treatment, right? And the opposite is true. Someone might be not assigned a treatment, but they may actually do the treatment on their own, okay? And we'll talk about that a little further.
Could I ask a quick, relatively elementary question on this?
Yeah.
What's it called if it's a trial, but it's not randomized and it's not controlled? Is it just, it's an intervention? Is it just a trial?
What's an example? Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking for in surgical intervention, sometimes we're just looking at a thing and we don't necessarily have a control group,
right.
And we're just looking at the outcome of that surgical intervention.
Yeah, that's usually meaning just a treatment. You're not looking at a control group.
Maybe we compare it to a historical.
Right. I mean, to some extent, it is going to be a comparison. You're rarely going to just do, you're going to compare it to something, right?
Yeah.
Surgical interventions are oftentimes the exception to these rules, and we'll see, right? You can't blind a surgical intervention. You can't, right? So there are certain things you can't do with surgical interventions. But yes, those are generally considered pilot studies, right? So you wouldn't be as concerned as your sample. So sometimes you can only do that on a handful.
Yeah.
Sometimes you could only do it on one, right? If you're trying to use a new valve for, cardiac surgery, you're not going to do it on a pig heart or whatever. You're gonna do it on one, 2, 3, a handful. That really wouldn't be considered a randomized trial.
Yes,
I'd call it a pilot study. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I think you can say that your comparator is a historical control. There are studies that do that.
Yeah, you can use
historical
right. When you say control group, you can use historical controls for sure. And we'll talk in observation studies. Obviously, this is done all the time. It's a little trickier for randomized clinical trials. It's definitely a ding, right? Because you're then retrospectively collecting data that was collected not for your purposes. So the monitoring by default is going to be different.
Yeah.
Not going to be as rigorous, et cetera. But yes, that is possible. So the purpose of randomization, again, trying to maintain comparability between the treated and untreated groups. And to try and protect your study from potential bias, right? So just like the James Lind example, we want to try and kind of keep everything equal for all other purposes, okay, than what we are interested in. Big but here, does not guarantee comparability. So imagine, a jar of black and white marbles and you want to randomly select 10, right? By doing it randomly, mixing it up and, picking it up and everything has sort of an equal chance of falling into your hands, we know that there is a possibility by chance that you will get 9 black and 1 white marble, right? That's not going to help you that much. If you really think that is a potential confounder, something that's not guaranteed comparability is a problem, right? So if you think, for example, that gender is a massive potential confounder for your study, or age, which is often the case, you may want to ensure comparability. And we'll talk about how we do that. It's called matching, right? So, or not matching here, that's for case control studies, but stratified randomization. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like. So first, before we get there, what happens if we don't randomize? Okay, so let's see an example. This was a study done to test the effectiveness of BCG vaccine. It was done in 1945, right? We know not 946. Deemed to be not that effective, so we stopped using the BCG vaccine in the States anyway. Okay, so back then in 1946, a trial was done. And the way it was done is they went around to certain practices of physicians in specific hospitals and said to them, we want you to vaccinate a certain number of children. And then there was a control group that did not get vaccinated. All right? These are the numbers that came up in terms of following them up for TB deaths. So in the vaccinated groups, approximately the same number of vaccinated and unvaccinated. The vaccinated group, there was a 0.67% rate of death, call it that, and 3.3% among the controls. So what is our conclusion based on these numbers? Vaccine effective? Assume statistical significance, and yeah, right? Looks like it's effective. What happened, though, is that they realized after doing some of these analyses that there was a problem, that it seemed like the physicians were just vaccinating cooperative children and cooperative parents, right? Introducing a bias. The bias, what we call you could think of it as a healthy user bias, is that these parents were more careful with their children's health care in general. They were more cooperative, indicative of other characteristics. And those were the ones the physicians were vaccinating. So this trial was redone. Where instead of telling the physicians, you get to pick who you are vaccinating, they decided to alternate vaccination. So every other child that walked in the door received a vaccination. Now that is not perfect randomization. That's what we call quasi-randomization. Because the physician still has the ability to sort of, change that, right? It's not pure random. And it could be that certain kids are coming in certain times of day, et cetera. So there are other things we introduce. But in general, it was a lot more random than the first time around. And look what happens.
Wait, I'm sorry. You said in a second they just do every other.
Every other, yeah.
But then what control does the physician have over that?
So the physician doesn't have any control, but when there's a known order to how you do it, first of all, every other child could still be affected by times of day, right? So it could still be that the children coming in, it could still be, well, that wouldn't be affected by that, but
Well, so for
Quasi-randomization,
example,
yeah.
so in my residency, our continuity clinic, there was a bus that stopped at a particular time of the day. So all the patients that needed to take a bus to the clinic arrived at the same time, whereas others who had cars were there at a different time. So clearly socioeconomic status was different at different
Would
times of
affect.
the day.
Right, so but here
every
it would be
other-
alternate. So the thing
Every
is,
other
it's
should be.
right, it could still be randomized. The idea is that anything that you know how it was determined, so let's say you say odd number medical records or every other child, allows for the physician to have the ability, should they want to, say, why don't you come back later, the next one, right? I know
Yeah.
that you will be chosen the next one, meaning it doesn't mean it happens, so that's why it's
Yeah.
called quasi-randomization. You could think of it as blinding if you want, but it's not pure randomization.
Okay.
Alternate is not random. It could function that way, and I think in this case it probably did, if all else goes well, right? So what was the result here? We got a lot closer between vaccinated and unvaccinated, right? So there was still a difference where the controls, actually in this case, the controls had a slightly worse outcome, but only slightly and not likely significant, right? So this was clearly a result. The result was the bias was introduced because of a lack of randomization in this case. Okay, so types of randomization is what we're talking about. So randomization, quasi-randomization, stratified randomization. I believe the definition is what I said, that it's any kind of known way that you're randomizing. It's not really random when you have some kind of pattern to it. So alternate is not random. Odd numbers is not random. Birth dates in March, not random, right? So that's still considered better than nothing, and it's quasi-randomization. It's not purely randomization. And then the third type is stratified randomization. And that happens when we are concerned that comparability may not be maintained purely through randomization on a variable that we are very, very, very interested in avoiding confounding for. Okay, so this is a bit complicated figure, but this is stratification. Okay, so you start with your study population, as in our first, we had that first flow chart, same way. We stratify first by sex in this case, then we stratify again by age, because age and sex, in this case, we are very interested to maintain comparability, okay? And then we randomize within each group. So we know we will have approximately the same number of older females, older males, younger males, but within that group, we want it to be a random assortment, okay? Is that clear?
So this is acceptable?
Yes, this is called stratified randomization. So this is a very bona fide, kind of clear approach to doing it, and very commonly used, because as I said before, if you just kind of dip into the population, and in this case remove 1,000 people, you may have way more women than men, or way more men than women, and it'll throw off what you're looking at. Yeah.
So I just wanted to know, how do you do that technically? Because normally if you randomize like online.
Yeah, so we're not going to go into the technical. I mean, the truth is there are probably much more sophisticated ways to do this. I haven't done too many randomized clinical trials. When I had to do randomization a couple times, like I use the SAS software. SAS has a function for randomization. Like there are just software programs, so you kind of get your IDs, unique IDs, and there are different ways to randomize.
And the stratification is included then?
So no, I think that there are methods to do that. Yeah, but you'd have to first. Right, I mean, it depends. You'd have to first ascertain, right, the patients that you have available to you to be in the trial, or you go out to recruit. Like a number of studies said, okay, we have to recruit. Our sample size based on power calculations is 1,000. We know we want half of those to be women, half of those to be men. We're going to recruit 500 men, 500 women, right? So, and then within those, you have to randomize, right? So it depends. There are all different methods to do it. If you want, I can link you to like a source, but right, there are like statisticians that specialize in this and different methods of recruitment that you can utilize to get to here. So that's randomization, blinding, or otherwise known as masking. So there are different groups that would be relevant to mask, right? So obviously the participant. In many cases, we have double blinding, which is the participant and the investigators. In some cases, they're triple blinding, which is the participants, the investigators, and those assessing the outcomes. Like everyone involved is basically blinded to treatment groups, right? Open trials, where all participants and investigators know who are getting an intervention, sometimes occur, and this depends on the treatment. For example, surgical treatments, right? You're not going to do a placebo surgery. But there could be different types of surgical procedures. You use a standard one versus a new one, right? But in some cases, we do utilize open trial methods. So this is, I'm not going to go through this, but this is in the slides in case you wanted to look at it later. Just potential benefits accruing like as a result of blinding. So what benefits the participants receive from this, the trial investigators, the assessors. This is pretty intuitive, right? So less likely to have biases. Okay, but let's look more interestingly at an example. So this is an example where blinding was compromised. What happens? So this was a clinical trial that was done, what year was this done? 1975. And this trial was done to assess the effects of vitamin C in preventing or mitigating a cold. This was done on about 300 employees from the NIH. They were administered vitamin C regularly, a couple times a day, and then when they felt a cold coming on, they were getting more vitamin C. And there was a vitamin C group and a placebo group. What happened is, halfway through the trial, the investigators realized that both groups suspected correctly what they were getting and why. The taste was very obvious. So the vitamin C taste was very obvious. And the placebo taste was obviously different. It was a very bitter taste. So they didn't put enough thought into making sure that these were comparable. Okay, so they did kind of this 2x2 table where they tried to ascertain halfway through the study, okay, how many people actually know what they're getting? So they took about 100 of these participants and asked them, ascertain the actual drug they were taking and asked them what their suspected drug. And a very high percentage, so in this case, of those, for example, taking thinking that they had the placebo, 78% were correct and that they were taking the placebo. Same thing for vitamin C, for the actual treatment. So they realized halfway through, we have a problem, and they did a number of things to sort of test the association. What's beautiful about this is that all this is in their paper, okay? So in true scientific method, and true, right, as we're supposed to behave as scientists and log everything, they logged their entire thing, what they did from the beginning, their in the middle, their additional trials. This is really important because A, it teaches the rest of us what to look out for, right? And B, this is the honest, correct way to present their research. Now, if they had published this before they realized that, they'd have to go make a correction and send in their error and and all that. So luckily they found it halfway through, but to their credit, they put it in this paper and it was published in JAMA. This specific association had a very strong placebo effect. So the people who actually were taking vitamin C but thought they were taking placebo had fewer colds than the opposite, right? So this association, vitamin C was not found to strongly affect the cold outcomes, but the placebo effect was very strong. Okay, and they found that breaking the blind design, when they redid the trial or redid what they had left of the trial, was contributing the most to any effects that they were finding. Okay, so this was a really good example of blinding gone wrong. Okay, so the final part of randomized clinical trials before we go on to observational is a talk about treatment. So I mentioned that we want to make sure that we have comparable outcome measurements or monitoring measurements for both groups or 4 groups or 6 groups, however many arms we have of this trial. We want to make sure they're comparable in terms of data on improvement and on side effects, okay, as well as measurement. So we may just be sort of giving our, placebo group the placebo or the standard of care and then kind of saying, well, we know what happens with that group. We always treat that group. We're not going to monitor them for the same side effects. If we don't do that and don't look at them as rigorously, we're going to probably see more side effects in the treated group erroneously, right? So we have to be very careful about that. And then there's treatment assignment. So there are different ways that you can assign treatment. One is the parallel trials, which is just the general flow the way we saw it initially. The 2 other kind of methods commonly used are crossover trials and factorial design. So this is a crossover trial. A crossover trial is really when each group serves as their own control. So every group gets a chance to get treatment A and then cross over to treatment B. And then treatment B crosses over to treatment A. The beauty of this is you're maintaining comparability in the best way you can, right? The individual is their own control, okay? What are some possible downsides?
You could have some therapy A could affect subsequent
Good.
therapy B.
Right, so crossover effects. So there may need to be a washout period, or you may not be able to do this because it's really a serious crossover effect that's not reversible, right? Another issue could be the order in which you do it. It could be that taking A and then B is substantively different than the other way around.
But you can test that.
Sorry,
But
what?
you can test that hypothesis.
You can test that, but you're not going to be, it won't be comparable. I mean, you could test that hypothesis later, but it's not, if that's true, then this is not an ideal design.
Right.
It's worse to sort of, if you think it's true, you can always account for something later, but you don't want to ideally set it up this way. And then the third part is that they may not be possible, right? If you're doing surgery, you're not going to reverse the surgery. So this is only amenable to some types of treatment.
Well, it could be interesting, for example, to see if the adjuvant treatment is better, or the neoadjuvant is better than the adjuvant. Something like that.
Right, to do both, you're saying?
Just different order.
Right, different order. Well, I think, right, if you're not doing it on the same person, then those are probably 2 separate treatment groups, right? And it's not really a crossover trial. But yeah, but it's sort of a sub, kind of reminiscent of it, but not purely this. Okay, and the other design is the factorial design. This is very useful for studying the effects of 2 treatments, in some cases more treatments. So you would have the original study population, like our flow, and you're assigning 2 treatments, let's say aspirin and placebo, but you also want to test the second treatment. In this case, it's beta-carotene and placebo. This is an example of an interesting trial that was done to measure 2 treatments for 2 different outcomes. So aspirin was for cardiovascular outcomes, and the beta-carotene was for cancer. But they kind of doubled up on this to use the same population in order to be the most efficient, right? So they used just the same population. This was a physician's health study, and kind of double, each group was able to get kind of each of the different things. So if you look at the 2x2 table, you see we have a group that got both, we had a group that had one, we had a group that had the other, and we had a group that had neither. What is one, aside from being efficient, what's one major advantage to this? Well, one is that you can continue one without the other. So what happens when halfway through the study, we see that aspirin is really beneficial, okay? Ethically, you need to end the study and give everyone aspirin, right? You can't continue a study when you know an obvious finding has come up, okay? So, but I'm halfway through the trial. I haven't gotten my answer about beta-carotene. Well, you can continue the beta-carotene arm and just leave out the aspirin. So this is a major advantage to factorial design.
When that happens and the 11,000 placebo group is now put on aspirin, do they just get knocked out of the trial and they just are on
So
aspirin,
that's a
or
good
do
question.
they get looped in?
I don't have enough experience knowing the protocol of this. My understanding is that they are made aware of the finding. So they would, in this case, you'd want, like, let's say you knock out that second row, you still want to maintain, you want to keep them in the study for the beta carotene part.
But I think Todd's point is like, if all of a sudden you see a beneficial effect from aspirin, if you now your groups are the like beta carotene versus placebo, and it's like 10,000 in the beta carotene and 10,000 in the placebo,
Yeah.
then the people that were initially in the aspirin placebo arm,
Right.
you're going to see a less effect. That's what you're saying. You're going to
If
see
there's-
less effect.
If there's some kind of, if they're interacting.
No, but even if not, right, then they would have not been receiving aspirin for the duration of the study up to that point.
Yeah, I feel like they should get knocked
Right.
out of the study.
Yeah.
You're saying, right. I think in this case, my understanding is that there was no reason to think that aspirin and beta carotene had an interactive effect.
Right.
So meaning, if these guys were told, okay, now you're going to start taking aspirin, and we're done with this comparison part, but we still
Totally.
want to continue this comparison part.
Right.
So we want you to maintain the beta carotene arm.
Right. I think you can't then combine the bottom row into two
As one.
groups because they will have had aspirin for like 6 fewer months.
Right, but you're not testing the aspirin use anymore. Meaning in the beta carotene part, if you think that the aspirin, you'd probably keep that possibility, right? You'd probably analyze them separately with an understanding, with all that information in there. But if you believe or you test that the aspirin and beta carotene do not interact with each other, meaning it wouldn't make a difference if you were taking aspirin for 6 months or not taking aspirin at all for the beta carotene piece, then there's no reason to drop them. Meaning that's the advantage of sort of doing these two together with the possibility, right? Now, in terms of, that's very dependent on the treatment, and I don't know the specific effects of aspirin and beta carotene in this case, but one of the known advantages of factorial design is that you don't have to abort the study because one arm isn't working, right? Unless obviously it has this crossover effect or there are other ethical considerations.
So we will basically just remove the.
You would remove,
and
right,
then
you have
we'll
the
go to
option, yeah, so you have the option technically of removing the aspirin piece.
Mm.
Whether, like, qualitatively, as Danielle's suggesting, there is an effect from the aspirin depends on the actual treatment, right? So in this case, I believe there wasn't, because it was sort of two different trials completely combined into one. But in the case where one affects the other, you, at best, at worst, you have to consider it. At best, you have to, right, like, just leave them out. Okay, and the last part that we mentioned is non-compliance. So patients can drop out, drop in, right? If they hear on the news that aspirin is good for them, then they're going to start taking it. If they, sometimes their treatment is exercise or other things that people can do on their own, they might be doing it. You may not know as an investigator if they take it or not. You often won't know if they stop taking their meds as an investigator. Last year we had someone in here who was working with adolescents. Adolescents are very non-compliant with their treatment, and they're not necessarily going to be forthcoming about it. So that is a major, major issue with randomized clinical trials. The effect of non-compliance, we're not going to go into it now because, again, it's like a whole other thing in and of itself, but it can reduce the difference between the treatment groups. It can affect your results, bias your results. Often, analytically, we deal with these with an intention to treat analyses. You guys have heard about it. So you would analytically treat them as if they were taking the treatment, even though they weren't, right? Their intention to treat. That's like a statistical tool to deal with this kind of differential, but it can be a major problem and introduce major bias. Okay, that was a quick run over clinical trials. We're going to talk about observational studies now. So observational studies can be classified into three main types, but there's a lot of discussion about semantics here. So I'm going to try to clarify some of that. One is a cohort study, often called a longitudinal study. You can call it sometimes retrospective cohort study, prospective cohort study. Usually those all reference cohort studies if they're referenced correctly. Then there's the case control study and a cross-sectional study. So just to quickly review measures of morbidity, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but I kind of want to review it quickly because it's going to come into play when we talk about some of these studies. The first is incidence. Okay, are you guys familiar with, have you studied before the difference between incidence and prevalence? Okay, some of you. So incidence is, and this is the epidemiologist in me being a stickler about it. So incidence is the number of new cases of disease, okay? Out of the universe of people, which is the denominator, the number of people at risk during that time period. Okay, so the incidence of breast cancer, you're not going to have men in the denominator. You're going to have the incidence out of all women in a certain specific period of time, okay? And that would be considered a rate, the incidence rate. So during a certain specific period of time, what are the number of new cases out of the number of population, of people at risk during that time? Prevalence, on the other hand, is the number of cases of disease at that specific moment in time, out of the people at risk at that specific moment in time. Okay, so it's like taking a slice out of the population at that moment. Okay, so what are some of the ramifications of this? This is very, very obvious when we look at HIV incidence and prevalence. So infection and those infected like at that given time, and then new infections. So in a steady state, so when everything is steady, prevalence will equal incidence time duration. So the new cases, the duration that those cases exist, together multiply those, and that is prevalence. Okay, so if you have very high prevalence, that could mean that your incidence is very high, but your duration is low, like people get it for only a short period of time. Or it could mean that your incidence is low and your duration is really high. So they're living with it for a long period of time. And that's really obvious when you look at HIV prevalence and incidence. So this is a graph looking at it from 1980 to 2010. You see that incidence, little spike in big spike, depending how you look at it, in 1983, 1984, early 80s, when there was an epidemic, and then reduced. Incidence was reduced and pretty much at a steady state. Okay, these are in the 100,000s, so it's a little misleading, but pretty much in a steady state and remains kind of low. But prevalence has been majorly on the rise because of treatment, right? So people are living longer with HIV infection. So if you're just going to look at prevalence here in 2010, you cannot make inference to incidence. Okay, so if you were just going to look at a study of prevalent cases of HIV, you may misleadingly come to the conclusion that there are many new cases of HIV, which would not be correct. Okay, so it's really important to distinguish between prevalence and incidence. Now, how could we do that in our observational studies? So cohort studies. Cohort studies are a comparison of exposed and non-exposed and looking at those people with respect to a particular outcome. Okay, so the main element of a cohort study, and this is really important with the nomenclature, is looking at those people over time. Okay, that's the main element that makes something a cohort study. That's why it's also called a longitudinal cohort study, or just a longitudinal study. The longitudinal part indicates that you are looking over a period of time, and you are comparing people who are exposed to people who are not exposed. Okay, and you have to start with people free of the disease, or else there's really no point in your study looking at incidence. Okay, so if you want to look at it as a flow chart, we start with the exposed and not exposed, and we follow them over a specific period of time. It could just be, a short period of time if this is a disease that's pretty common with high incidence. And we see if the disease develops versus not in each group. Now, if you just want to put it side by side, a randomized trial to get a better idea, in both cases, the experimental study and the observational study, okay, which is non-experimental and non-randomized, right? We have not randomized people to exposure or non-exposure. This is real life, they randomize themselves, hopefully. You start with the population, you randomly assign them to a treatment or exposure, okay? In the observational study, the cohort study, they're self-selected to this exposure. Okay, so in terms of data collection, which is really the point of our discussing these studies today, what are some of our potential problems or issues? One is with population selection. Okay, we have to select a population to observe, and this population has to stay with us for us to follow them up over time. In an ideal world, all our participants stay with us the whole time. In the real world, they do not. Okay, so that leads to a potential selection issue. And then we have the semantic prospective versus retrospective that I'm going to clarify. Okay, so population selection. We have one major issue of selection bias. There are a number of biases that affect all studies. One major bias, a potential bias that really can affect all studies, but cohort studies are vulnerable to because they have to stick with you throughout the time period, is a loss to follow-up issue. So you're starting a study, you want people to stick with you for 5 years, whatever, 1 year, 10 years, sometimes 20 years. They leave, and they have a right to leave, okay? Those that leave could be sicker, and in fact, they usually are sicker, okay? They also could have be more or less exposed to your exposure. The major, and we will talk about this when we talk about bias. We're going to have one class where we really delve deep into bias, confounding, causation. And we'll talk about this a bit more. A problem, when a bias becomes a problem of selection bias, is when the loss to follow-up is related to the exposure and the disease, not to one or the other. So for example, if I'm studying socioeconomic status and heart disease, and those who drop out are more likely to be poor and have heart disease, that's when I have real problems, okay? So then the people that are left that are poor are the hardier people that did not have heart disease. They're no longer representative of the general poor population, right? So it's really important to think about, you're always gonna have some sort of potential bias, but when first of all, one of the reasons for the limitation sections, right, in your paper is to acknowledge, I know that I might have the following potential biases. No study is perfect, especially not observational studies. So for example, from a reviewer's perspective, I can tell you, as long as an author acknowledges or investigator acknowledges what their biases are, they're usually tolerated, right? As long as they thought it through, it doesn't have a major effect. They've done a little bit of analysis to see, is this truly happening? Is it not happening? How is this going to affect my bottom line if it is happening? If you've gone through that process, it's okay. Your study is worth something. You just need to acknowledge the limitations. So very often we have this loss to follow-up issue. An important thing to combat this is to actually try to follow up as much as you can, or to initially do some sort of assessment of the characteristics of everyone that walks in that door, if they're eligible, if they're not eligible. Okay, so even the non-eligibles, you want to know, were they different with regard to race, gender, ethnicity, other things, as much as you can, right? You're not going to burden ineligible participants. And then if they're lost to follow-up, so for example, these big studies over time, yes, you can of course leave a study whenever you want, but they try to track them down. They try to call them every year. Why didn't you stay? And we know a little bit about them because they were there in the beginning. So we need to keep information about them. And when I do a study and I kind of tease out people, I compare them to the initial population. You always have some sort of comparison because you want to know if your loss to follow-up is differentially biased. Okay, non-participation is kind of the same issue. So people cannot participate to begin with or leave in the middle of a study. And then there's the issue of generalizability. So if I've selected a population, like for Framingham, the first Framingham studies of middle-aged white men, okay, so that was the population available at the time, or this study was done on them at the time. But when you do your data inference, you have to keep that in mind. So we have projected the results from Framingham onto the rest of the population, including non-white middle-aged men. Is that correct? Should we be going back? Is it generalizable to the rest of the population? So that's something to keep in mind when you do a study. It's not a reason not to do it. Non-diversity is not a reason not to do a study, but there's definitely more sensitivity to sort of be more inclusive in order to make your study more generalizable. Okay, so we're going to skip this for the sake of time. To explain prospective and retrospective for a moment. So again, this is the flow of a cohort study. You start with a population, non-randomized, right? So you're just exposed versus not exposed, and you're following up for disease. In a prospective study, you're starting with a population, and then from then on, you follow them up. Okay, in this case, 2012 was the beginning of my study, and I'm following them up for 20 years. Okay, in a retrospective study, I might begin my study here in 2012. Okay, but I have retrospective records that I was able to ascertain what was happening to them that whole period of time. Okay, that's still a cohort study. This is still longitudinal. Okay, if I was really able to start when they didn't have the disease, that's what makes it longitudinal. Not the chronological calendar order that you do your study, but the chronological calendar order of your participants, right, of their experience. It's not your experience, it's their experience, okay? So if I am utilizing a birth registry, then I'm starting when people were born. They did not have that disease. I'm following them up for the outcome. That's perfectly fine in terms of calling it a longitudinal study. It's just the assessment of my records is retrospective. Okay, so that's really important to keep in mind, that distinction. And in some cases, by the way, it's a mix. So I've done studies on socioeconomic status and disease and heart disease where for adult outcomes, we have prospectively, but childhood outcomes, we've asked them about their childhood. So that's retrospective, okay? Both in the same study, which is perfectly legitimate. All right, so these are just some nomenclature and quickly like the pros and cons. Prospective study is also called a concurrent study, a longitudinal study. The pro for this study is that there's a temporal sequence of events, right? So you're following them up over calendar time. The con is that it's expensive, time-consuming. And then the retrospective study, also called non-concurrent or historical, less time use and less expense. The major con is you have information bias, right? So if I'm asking you about your childhood experiences, there's clearly a recall issue, okay? It's not happening right now, so you're not going to recall it with as much certainty.
If we go to a database, we don't rely on reporting from the subjects, does that minimize?
Yes, definitely. Depending on, yes, that minimizes recall because you're not asking them to recall. Yeah. You might be introducing retrospective data collection, yeah, right? So if maybe data collection was collected, like data was collected differently back then.
Okay. Yeah.
But yes, that for sure minimizes it. Any kind of objective measure minimizes recall. And self-report, by the way. You can ask someone today about their condition, but the self-report has always that element to it. Okay. Case control studies. I want to leave a little time for this. So case control studies are a little different. You don't start with exposure. You're really starting with disease and no disease, cases and no cases, okay, and controls. You cannot determine incidence from a case control study because, remember, incidence is new cases over time. You are taking the cases that occur right now, not following up a non-diseased population for new cases, right? So you cannot measure incidence unless you have this longitudinal study. Okay, so you're starting with, yeah. Yeah.
If you, like in a randomized control trial, and you have two groups, and then you follow them for a couple of years, and then you're looking at the incidence of whatever side effect or something, you can call that incidence.
Yes, if it's a group of non-diseased individuals, and you're following them up over time for this disease or condition, then it's considered incidence. Yes.
Okay, they have disease, but something else within the disease, another side effect.
Yes, when I say disease, I mean any kind of condition that you're interested in looking at, right? You're looking for high blood pressure side effects. That's the disease, right, that we're talking about here. The difference is it's not a subset of the population. It's a manipulated group of participants that came to your study. So you can say the incidence in my sample. But when I have a population-based study where 500 people were randomly recruited from Los Angeles County or something like that, I can more accurately say that it's likely that the incidence of hypertension in the population is X because I'm randomly picking a population-based sample. So we don't usually use results from a randomized controlled trial and then say the incidence of, hypertension in the population. We are very careful about our language, which we'll talk about in another, and say the incidence of X side effect in our participant population. Do you understand the distinction? So it's not the incidence as in an epidemiologic incidence. It's the incidence in your trial. Okay, so that's the thing.
I didn't expect, for example, they all got the same treatment.
Yeah.
All got surgery, and it's something I didn't expect.
An unexpected side effect.
Because it's something new.
Right. But you have to make sure, if you know that they were clean, they didn't have that condition before, like all of them got it and all of them didn't have it to begin with?
Yes.
Right. So yeah, so that would be the incidence of X or the incidence of this side effect in my trial. I think that the term incidence may be used, may not be utilized in a randomized trial because there is some kind of connotation of like the epidemiology of a condition when you use the term incidence, right? But if you're careful to say the incidence in my trial or the incidence of among my participants, yeah, then you can use that.
How do you interpret the term frequency as opposed to
Frequency is the number of times it occurs.
But
So the frequency, okay, so in lay language, the frequency of occurrence is it occurred a lot or a little, or right. In statistical language, frequency usually relates to the number of times. When we want to say percentage, we say the percentage of times something occurs. So we have a denominator.
so the frequency of an event.
Is how often it occurs, I would say. Yeah.
So like, could you say, I don't know, the frequency of side effect X in this population was?
What you're sort of implying when you say frequency is you wouldn't say frequency for that. You would say the percentage. Like frequency and this is a very semantic thing. Again, it depends on the field, right? I know as an epidemiologist, you wouldn't utilize that word the way you would in like regular language.
Yeah, that's right.
Because frequency sounds like something is happening a lot or a little. It's not. You would say the prevalence of this effect or the proportion. You'd give a proportion, right? You wouldn't give an absolute number because that is not very meaningful. Yeah. Okay, so the design of the case control study, we said we start with the disease, we start with the cases and the controls, and we go backwards and basically see who is exposed and not exposed. This is a very commonly used study design, mainly because it can be done right away. Another massive advantage of a case control study is that you can do it with a very rare condition. And so like epidemics or like unknown diseases or very rare diseases, you'll utilize this design because you just want to know fast, like what are my comparison groups? What could they have been exposed to? And another thing is you don't need to totally know exposure beforehand because once you have cases and controls, you can test them for all sorts of exposures simultaneously. In a cohort study, you're starting with a specific exposure, non-exposure, and then you're following them up for a disease. So you're kind of wedded to that exposure. With a case control study, you're not. Okay, so it has a little more flexibility. The major issue in terms of data collection for case control studies is the selection issues, population selection, okay? So, and most importantly, the control selection, which we'll talk about. So selecting cases. So cases can be selected from, hospitals, clinics. I won't go into incidence of prevalent, but mostly you're going to be looking at prevalent cases, okay? You're usually not looking at incident cases in case control studies because you want the cases at this point in time you don't always know how long they've been cases for. And so you don't have the incident element to it. This could lead to survival bias, by the way. If a disease has very high mortality rate, you're not likely to capture those who immediately died after getting this disease. Okay, they can't be in your study because they're not alive. And so you end up with this like hardier group of people who can survive with the disease for longer. Okay, that introduces a whole different bias to the study. So that's very, you know, depending on your disease of question, but that's something to keep in mind. Okay, controls. This is the area of a lot of concern in case control studies. You are different than, as opposed to a cohort study where you're not choosing your comparison group, because people naturally have a comparison group, right? Those who smoked versus those who didn't smoke in this population, okay? Here, you are manipulating your control group. So when you manipulate your control group, you have a lot of power and a lot of responsibility, right? You need to be very careful because you can find yourself a control group where you're kind of causing certain bias that we'll talk about in a second. So when thinking about who your controls should be, should they represent non-cases in the population or be as similar as possible to the cases in the study? Meaning, do you want your, let's say your cases are, you know, lung cancer, right? And your exposure to smoking, right? So your lung cancer cases, do you want them to be as similar as possible to the rest of the population out there, okay? Or, but just not have lung cancer? Or do you want them to be as similar to your lung cases in terms of their source, where they come from? So sometimes you'll see case control studies where the controls are taken from the same hospital, and sometimes you'll see case control studies where the controls are taken from the general population. That will be, they're both legitimate, but that will be like an element that you have to really think through based on your specific question. So potential sources, and one way to do this is also matching. So if you heard of matching case control studies, so often what will happen is I have a case for every case. So let's say my case is a 50-year-old female. I am going to find a 50-year-old female control. Okay, that's matching. So you've matched on variables that you think are potential confounders, and that's how you set up your control group, right? The downside of matching is that if you ever want to then look at these variables, you can't. Once you've matched, you've set them equal, okay? So you can no longer look at the gender differences, you can no longer look at the age differences, but you've accounted for them. So you have to think through what you do before you start. Okay, and case control studies are obviously very prone to information bias because they have that retrospective element. You're always looking back to see exposure, unless you have some objective sources, right? But still, even then, they're usually historical. Okay, so a really interesting case control issue where there was a massive control selection bias was a case that occurred in 1929. Okay, this was a study done by Pearl and others, and they were looking at the association between TB and cancer. Okay, so does TB affect the prevalence of cancer, or I won't use the term incidence because it's case control, but is TB a risk factor for cancer? Okay, so what they did was they looked at consecutive autopsies of about 700 700 consecutive autopsies in Johns Hopkins, okay? And then they selected every time they got to a case, which in this case was cancer, they'd pull it out, okay? So out of that list of consecutive autopsies, they found 816 cases. So autopsies that had indications of cancer, okay? And then they confirmed the cancer cases, and then they chose 816 of those autopsies that did not have cancer to be the control group. Okay. They did the assessment as to the number of autopsies with evidence of TB, and then they found these results. So 6.6% of the cases had TB, and 16.3% of the controls had TB. A lot more controls had TB. So what is your conclusion from this? What can you conclude? It's protective of cancer, right? So it doesn't cause it, but the opposite. They were finding that more of the controls it looked like TB is actually protective of cancer. If anything, TB may prevent cancer. Okay, it was the other direction. It definitely didn't cause it, but it looked like the opposite direction. Okay.
In this type of study, though, too, you actually you would only be able to say really that TB is associated with not having cancer because you can't tell the direction.
Right.
I mean,
so your odds ratio, for example, would be under 1, which is a protective odds ratio.
But
and it might be statistically significant. So you're right, there's a 2-tailed issue and a 1-tailed issue, right? You're setting out to test your hypothesis that TB causes cancer. In this case, you are finding, and I shouldn't use the word causing, okay, associated with cancer. Actually, I have to check the study to see what their hypothesis is.
Because we
end up killing a bunch of young kids who didn't have time to develop cancer because TB killed them too early.
You're suggesting that this could occur here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, the BCG. Well, it's not BCG has been used as a treatment. Hasn't it been used as treatment for cancer later on? BCG was used anyway. No, that's not. You'll see that that's not the finding here because this was actually erroneous, and I'll explain to you why. If you set out and your hypothesis is TB, I'm just giving an example for here because I'm not sure this was their hypothesis. TB causes cancer, okay? You find the opposite, that TB, you find a lower odds ratio that's statistically significant, then you have found the opposite of your hypothesis. Now, your conclusion is we did not, our hypothesis, we did not find significant evidence to back up our hypothesis. However, we found this unexpected result, okay? It turned out this is not accurate because what happened was they were utilizing autopsies from Hopkins. Hopkins, the number one reason so their control group here was hospitalized people at Hopkins who did not have cancer, okay? But it turns out one of the main reasons to be hospitalized at the time at Johns Hopkins was for TB, okay? So the control group was not comparable to the outside rest of the population. They had very, very high rates of TB because they were hospitalized in this preeminent, medical center that was treating the top treatment for TB in the country. Okay, the mistake was in their control selection. So these results weren't erroneous. They could not be replicated. Okay, that's one of the reasons that we try to replicate our findings. And this was actually redone by researchers named Carlson and Bell. And they compared, instead of taking this just non-cancer kind of group of controls, they ended up taking patients at Hopkins who died of heart disease. So they picked another disease that was not related to TB in order to be the control group. And this was a really preeminent paper to kind of teach this problem, okay? So in the end, TB had no association with cancer one way or the other. But I think your theory might be true, but I don't think it was tested here. Okay, so matching. I'm not sure we're going to go into this because we talked about it, and I want to leave some time to review some of the studies. But if you have questions about matching, feel free to approach me if this is an issue for you. And problems with matching I talked about. Okay, and nested case control I think I'm also going to skip. This is the tables here are just for your kind of reference. And it just kind of goes through the semantics we talked about. What is a prospective cohort study, retrospective cohort study, case control study, the common measures of risk that are used. This is an excerpt from Leon Gordis's epidemiology textbook, which is very, very useful. So it's kind of just a cheat sheet. And this is just the rest of it. So feel free to look at those slides. Okay, cross-sectional studies I'm going to cover very briefly. They're essentially a simultaneous comparison of exposure and outcome. Okay, so we don't have any element of looking back. We also don't have the manipulating of controls and cases because just like the cohort study, we're looking at a population. We're not splitting them up into, we're not bringing our control group separately and our cases separately. and we just gather data on exposure and disease at the same time. We cannot assess incidence from this, right? There's no element of time. We can assess prevalence. And this is a very useful study design because it's very efficient, it's less time consuming, it's effective, but very limited in inference. Okay, data collection from a cross-sectional study can come from a number of different things. It can come from survey data, just data at that time, lab data, right? It doesn't, patient data that you have right now, your patients in your clinic, or it can come from cohort study data. So this is really important. Sometimes you will see cross-sectional studies that utilize data from a longitudinal cohort study. What makes it cross-sectional is because they only utilize data from one wave. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you used a longitudinal data set. If you're only looking at one period of time, your study is cross-sectional. Okay. Again, this is another kind of table for you as a cheat sheet. And what we are going to do now, this is just semantics because I was mentioning like people use different terminology. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, we don't have that much time, but I want to review some of the studies you looked at because they're really interesting in terms of some of these study designs. And then I think it could answer some questions also, or may generate some questions along the way. So how many of you, what paper did you read? Let's go around. You said you read the McMahon, right?
Greatest, yeah.
Did you manage? Okay.
Polycystic ovary.
Oh, the low study, yeah.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, so, these are just some questions, and they're just some questions for you to consider, right? We're going to be reviewing some of these today. I'm actually going to do it. And in case, if you don't have, this is just an extra copy of each of the studies, so I don't know, if you don't have your laptop in front of you, kind of want to just take a copy of it. So let's first look at the McMahon study, the questions of the case control study, which is the pancreas cancer and coffee drinking one. And just to show you, this created a big splash when it happened. Okay, this is 1981. New York Times, March 12th, study links coffee use to pancreas cancer. Okay, you'll recall a recent study that showed coffee drinking is good for you. Okay, this is what makes the general population crazy with science studies, right? One day you have one thing the other, and then people stop listening to you. Okay, and they're hard to explain. Okay, so this study came out. This was published in, I think this is New England. Yeah, reputable journal, reputable investigators. But there were some major issues that came up with the control group, just to show you we're all human. And, this can happen. Okay, so what is the main objective of this study? What was the main objective?
To determine the association between smoking, coffee, tea, alcohol, and pancreatic cancer.
Right, so what was interesting actually in the main objective is they were more interested in smoking and pancreatic cancer. They threw in the coffee drinking and tea drinking, but it wasn't the main thing, to get to your question. So our study objective is really the most important thing, but sometimes we have unexpected results that we have to report. Okay, so how are the cases selected? So first of all, how are the cases selected? Let's start with that. Danielle's hard. She read it.
Patients with pancreatic cancer treated at this hospital.
Right, so it was actually 11 hospitals in Boston and Rhode Island, and the patients with, a certain number of patients with pancreatic cancer became the cases. Now, how are the controls selected? So, interestingly, the same physicians that treated the cases were asked to recruit controls. So the controls came from the same hospitals during the same period of time, from the same physicians, and they recruited a certain number of controls. Now, the advantage, what's a major advantage to that? Same physician, same hospital. Convenience, for sure.
Money.
Right. Convenience, money, comparability, right? So maybe there's a socioeconomic factor to going to these particular hospitals, these particular physicians. Yeah, what were you going to say?
I don't know that, I mean, I guess this is part of the problem with it, but just, I think it's unusual that the same physician is taking care of like a pancreatic cancer patient and somebody with something totally unrelated.
So these weren't,
maybe it was different.
I think it was the first, meaning the GI physician. So the first initial admitting physician or treating physician, it wasn't like the oncologist that treated the cancer, but it was I believe they were just GI physicians.
Or maybe we're just used to UCLA model
and
where
it could
everything
be,
is like so subspecialized.
Right.
But.
So patient tumors. Interesting. That's a good. That's a question, but who they were.
I just feel like at least here, the people taking care of the pancreatic cancer patients aren't really taking care of that many other patients.
Yeah, no, interesting with the patients.
With no other diseases.
Okay,
I mean,
keep that in mind because that's actually.
Yeah.
Okay, so
on the pancreatic side, it is
there's like
so
there's
these,
a whole pancreatic team.
Yeah.
So this was clearly not a pancreatic team because you'll see obviously, but you'll see why what you're mentioning is actually crucial to the problem in this study. But yes, at this specific time period, hospital, they were physicians treating a number of different patients, different cases. So the advantage was that they're similar. You can obtain permission from the same physician, efficient, whatever. How could this method of selection introduce bias in this study? Okay, so this was the major issue. The controls, exactly what you're saying, the physicians were GI physicians, and their other patients who were non-pancreatic cancer patients had been told, because they had a number of GI problems, not to drink coffee. They were not coffee drinkers. They did not have the same rates of coffee drinking as the rest of the population. So what are you left with? You're left with, so the control group are people that don't have pancreas cancer, and your exposure is coffee drinking. So they have, let's say they have IBS, right? They have other GI conditions. So they are unusually low coffee drinking population. So you're left with a group, right? So you're left with a group that, and they didn't know this at the time, right? So that's why I think I mentioned to your group that NHANES, for example, so this is cross-sectional studies or studies out there that you can just ascertain kind of quick prevalence of a particular disease or a particular condition or behavior in a population is very useful, because what they should have done is say, okay, based on other studies, we know 40% of the population drinks coffee. Oh my goodness, our controls, like only 10% of them drink coffee. I'm just making that up. That's a problem, right? Well, you don't want to. It's your exposure. So you want to set everything else equal except for your exposure. But if your exposure is going to be very artificially different in your control group, there goes your whole study, right? So they found this out halfway. They didn't have coffee wasn't their main concern. What they did actually, interestingly, is patients with diseases known to be associated with smoking or alcohol use were excluded, because those are things that they were worried about. So their main thing was smoking. They weren't thinking so much about the coffee part of it. So they excluded people with diseases that were specifically related to smoking, but they didn't think about diseases that were specifically related to coffee drinking. Okay, that was kind of a secondary variable, but it turned out to be their unexpected finding, and then it turned out, because of their control selection, to be their unexpected finding. So this was a very big issue. And the way they found it is studies went crazy. The scientific community and the lay community kind of went crazy with this, and right away they started doing additional replicated studies, and no one could replicate this finding. And that's when the wheels started turning, started really rigorously assessing this. And Mac Mahone himself, the investigator in this, was very, they were part of the process, right? It wasn't like some kind of fraudulent thing. It was just a mistake, essentially, in the design. So they did another, actually, study and they did take patients who were in there from another, right, not a GI kind of specialty, and they didn't find this association. Okay, so it wasn't replicated, and not the opposite was found, but this wasn't found to be true. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Let's. So that's the McMahon case control study. So who read the? You said you read the Lowe study, right? This is the PCOS. Okay. So, yeah, skimmed it, whatever. This is a really interesting thing because this was so, in my mind, egregious that it was kind of remarkable. I mean, this isn't from a particularly well-known journal. This is the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. I'm very interested in PCOS, and I've done a number of studies on PCOS. It's very, pretty prevalent, but also not well studied. And their problem was there really isn't a lot of data out there on PCOS because any reproductive health data for women tend to determine eligibility based on regular menses, and obviously PCOS patients do not have regular menses. So you have a really big problem in ascertaining. Transvaginal ultrasounds are invasive, and it's not an easy thing to just collect these data. So, but this is a really good example of perspective and retrospective. So they were saying the incidence of PCO in the community is difficult to determine. So to obtain accurate figures, they had this brilliant idea. Let's go to a fertility clinic. Let's sample 100 men, so men that have infertility, and let's ask them for their partners to be recruited. So there's no reason why the men were coming in for their infertility, and so the partners could have, they're just a random sample of the population. And out of the 100, let's find out who has PCOS. So they did that. It was actually a very clever way of getting the women in the door, but the problem was they keep calling it incidence. Is it incidence? There's no time. It's very, very clearly prevalence. And throughout this whole study, they refer to this as incidence, as new cases.
They actually, at one point too, even compare it to a chart of prevalence. They have a chart of prevalence from other studies.
Right.
So they clearly recognize that they basically throw them in together as though there's no difference. Not like they misunderstood it, but they see them as direct synonyms for each other.
So, or not, they were making the distinction. Look at all those studies that have prevalence. We have incidence, but it was not true.
Oh, I didn't notice.
They said like most studies have prevalence. We want to look for incidence, but they just redefined incidence to be this retrospective thing. Because we can back check, I don't know why they defined incidence this way, but it was a really egregious example of, and I happen to be on a committee of writing up these epidemiologic guidelines for studying PCOS because it's complicated and the data are hard to find. And this was such an egregious example of so they had this aha idea of how to get people in the door, but it was not what they were trying to do. So anyway, I thought this was very interesting.
If they had just said prevalence everywhere, they said incidence.
Yeah, it's fine.
Otherwise, everything.
The study wasn't done badly or incorrectly.
It's just a cross-sectional.
And we'll talk about what data inference, interpretation, what happens, right? So you could do your study perfectly well, and the study design be perfect, but your conclusions could be wrong because of the words you're using, right? So we have to be careful how we word things. That's why I was telling you. That is a really big problem in some studies. This is a really egregious problem because, they're using a term that's not correctly used. But even, epidemiologists cringe when the words like causality is used. Causality, to prove causality, you basically have to do a really clean randomized clinical trial or a unbelievably clean longitudinal, cohort study that probably started at birth, right? You can't really determine causality so easily. So we just have to be careful with the language we use. So we're kind of out of time. I don't know if you guys have a couple more minutes to talk about the Stanford article, but feel free to run out if you have to run out. We'll just take 3 or 4 minutes. Any of you skim over the Stanford one? That was a longitudinal. Okay, so an interesting thing with this is, I don't know if you remember the whole issue of hormone replacement therapy and coronary heart disease, right? So that there was an idea in the 90s that there's a decreased risk of coronary heart disease with use of hormone replacement therapy. And then RCT trials were done as a result of that, and they found the opposite, that there's an increase in heart disease. These are one of the cohort studies that found a decrease, okay? And it turns out part of it was a selection bias that they determined that was a healthy user bias. So the people who were using the hormone replacement therapy were healthier people because they were doing all sorts of other things, right? They're using their meds, they're probably thinner, they're probably exercising, they're doing all sorts of other things, and then it erroneously looks like they have lower heart disease. Again, this is not a study design problem. This is a kind of conclusion problem. So yes, they came to that conclusion here, but it probably should have been a little more tempered. And before they make the conclusion said, okay, this is suggestive of X, we're now going to do randomized clinical trials to test it. And instead, their conclusion was just grander, right? Okay, so that we're done with that. Feel free, I know we kind of sped through it, but there's only way to squeeze it all in. For the next class, you have that other, the Madres de Salud study. And then for a week from now, we just want to get your project topic ideas. If you have a problem coming up with a topic, we're happy to help you with it. But in order to get you going, we kind of want you to have some idea. So feel free to reach out.
Those are both due Monday?
No, so the project topic is due Wednesday. And again, if you don't have an idea, that's fine. You could sit, we're happy to sit with you, find a time to talk, and just literally, I want to look at, you could email us, you could tell us at the next class, or okay, that's it. See you Monday.
Thank you.
Thanks.